when Vera Calloway died in the passenger seat of her own car on a Tuesday in February. Her daughter and her son-in-law split what she left behind before the ground had thawed enough to bury her. The house on Briarfield Road sold in 11 days. The savings account was emptied before the funeral reception ended. Vera's son-in-law, a man named Craig Dunmore, moved through the estate the way a man moves through a hardware store, efficiently, without sentiment, with a clear idea of what he came for. Vera's daughter, his wife Shelley, stood beside him and signed what he put in front of her and called it handling things. What Vera's other daughter received was what nobody wanted. A closed watch repair shop on Elgin Street in a town called Merritt Falls, 4 cardboard boxes Craig had taped shut himself, a ring of keys on a split ring that had gone rusty at the joint, and a car so old the heater only worked if you held the knob at a particular angle. Ivy Calloway was 53 years old. She had been divorced for 2 years, the kind of divorce that leaves a person not just alone but confused about how they got there. She had $214 in her checking account, a rented room above a Vietnamese restaurant on Bank Street in Ottawa, and a standing arrangement with the leasing office of a building that was fast running out of patience for her. She had not spoken to her mother in 7 months when her mother died. That was the number she could not put down. 7 months. She had been angry about something she could not even properly name anymore. A comment at Christmas, a silence on her birthday, the particular way her mother had of making her feel like the draft version of a daughter rather than the final one. She had planned to call. She had planned it for 7 months, and then there was no one to call. Craig had driven out to the shop himself the week after the funeral, spent 20 minutes inside, and come back with the keys and the estimate from a salvage outfit that would clear the contents for $400, provided someone else hauled the furniture. He dropped the keys on the table at the reception, like they were a set he'd found in a jacket pocket and hadn't been looking for. "It's basically worthless," he said. He said it to Shelley, but he said it in a room where Ivy could hear. The lease expired. Town could probably condemn it. There's some equipment in there, but nothing moves for more than scrap. He pushed the boxes across the table with his foot. "Her stuff from the place. Tools, some old notebooks. I went through it, nothing in there worth keeping." Ivy picked up the keys. They were cold and heavier than they looked, the largest one wrapped in electrical tape that had gone brittle at the edges, and on the tape in her mother's cramped print the word front. "That's it then," Ivy said. Shelley was already checking her phone. The shop had been closed for 8 months by the time Ivy drove out to it, which meant her mother had locked the door without telling her. Which meant there were things her mother had done in the last year of her life that Ivy had not known about. Which meant the 7 months of silence had cost her more than she'd known to calculate. She parked on Elgin Street and sat in the car with the heater running at its peculiar angle and looked at the building for a long time before she could make herself go in. It was a narrow storefront wedged between a closed travel agency and a barber shop that had been there since the 70s. A hand-lettered sign in the window read Calloway & Co. Watch and Clock Repair. Est. 1971 in letters that had once been gold. The window below the sign was dark. A paper notice from the municipality was taped to the lower corner, the kind that mentions bylaws. Ivy unlocked the front door. A small brass bell above it gave a single note, flat and familiar, and then the smell reached her and she had to put both hands on the door frame. Oil. A particular kind, thin and clean, the kind used on small moving parts. Under it, wood and old paper and something that was simply her mother. The smell of a cardigan, of hand cream, of a woman who spent 40 years of her life bent over tiny mechanisms with a loop in her eye. A smell that had no right to still be alive in a room her mother had left 8 months ago. Ivy stood in the doorway and did not move. The shop was a single long room, narrow as a train car, lit by what came through the front window. A glass display case ran the length of the left wall, empty now but for a single forgotten price tag curled at one corner. Behind the counter, 3 workbenches, each with its own lamp on a gooseneck, each surface swept clean. On the wall above them, pegs and hooks and small labeled bins that Vera had organized by size and type, and some system that only made sense to her. The labels were still there, the bins were still there. The lamps were off, but the benches were not dusty. That was the first thing that didn't fit. Ivy walked the length of the room, trailing her fingers along the display case, feeling the cool of the glass. The back room was separated by a curtain. Her mother had sewn herself from a piece of wool she'd bought at a surplus sale in 1994, bottle green, worn thin at the hem. Ivy pushed through it. The back room was small. A work table, A stool, a shelf unit of the particle board variety, that had been repaired so many times it was more bracket than shelf. On the floor in the corner sat a small space heater unplugged, and in the center of the floor, the concrete floor that Ivy had walked across 100 times as a child coming to visit after school, there was a seam. She would not have seen it if she hadn't been looking for something to do. She had been staring at the floor the way a person stares at something when they are not ready to look at anything else, and the seam caught her eye because concrete doesn't seem that way. Not that way, not in a rectangle, 2 feet by 3, with a join so clean it had to have been cut with intention. Ivy crouched down. She had grown up watching her mother take apart watches, which meant she had grown up watching a person look at small things carefully. She looked at this carefully. There was a handle, recessed, the kind that sits flush with the surface and requires a fingernail to lift. Her mother's fingernail or someone else's had worn a bright crescent into the edge of it. Ivy got her thumb under it and pulled. The panel lifted on a piano hinge, smooth and silent, as if it had been opened recently. Beneath it was a space, maybe 10 inches deep, lined with a folded quilt, the kind her mother called a utility quilt. Not pretty, made to work, and inside it, arranged the way her mother arranged everything, in a system only she had built and understood, were 5 objects. 3 binders, the coil-bound kind, their plastic covers cracked from use, their edges thick with paper. A metal tin, the kind that once held shortbread at Christmas, its lid pressed down tight and, when Ivy lifted it, heavier than cookies. A craft envelope, thick sealed with the name of a law office on the return label. A small passbook the kind banks stopped issuing 30 years ago, pale blue cover, Hartwell Trust Company stamped in silver. And on top, flat and plain, a white envelope with a single word written on it in the handwriting Ivy had known since before she could read. Ivy. She sat back on her heels with the binders and the tin and the passbook spread around her on the concrete floor, and her hands were not working the way they usually worked. Outside, a truck went down Elgin Street, and the bell above the front door moved slightly in the draft, and was, "If you found this channel for the first time today, welcome. You're going to want to stay for this one because what Vera Calloway hid under the floor of her repair shop, about to change everything Ivy thought she understood about the woman she spent 7 months not speaking to. Hit subscribe and don't go anywhere." She opened the passbook because it was the only thing she recognized. The account was in her mother's name. The first entry was dated 28 years ago, a deposit of $5. After that, the entries ran down page after page and on to the next and the next. Regular deposits almost every month, never large. $5. 10, occasionally 20. 3 times in the whole record 50. The final entry was dated 4 months before her mother died, and the balance beside it read $31,240. Ivy read the number 3 times. Her mother had run a watch repair shop where the most expensive job was $120, and most were closer to $40. She had lived in a 2-bedroom house she rented, driven a car she'd bought used in 2009, and sewn her own curtains because she said the ones at Home Sense were priced for people with more house than sense. Craig had emptied the one account anyone in the family knew about, just under $11,000, within a week of the funeral. This account had never been mentioned to anyone. Ivy opened the tin. It held cash, not a dramatic amount, not a movie amount. Folded bills, mostly 5s and 10s, worn soft from handling, the kind of soft that means they'd passed through many hands before they came to rest here. On top of the bills, a piece of paper in her mother's writing, "For the clock tin, so the next one doesn't go without." She did not know yet what the clock tin was. She set the tin down the way you set down something that might wake. She opened the craft envelope. Inside was a document she had to read twice to understand. A deed of ownership for the building she was sitting in, the narrow storefront on Elgin Street, lot number and legal description and all of it. Purchased outright 9 years ago for $34,000 cash. The buyer was listed as Vera Ann Calloway. Ivy had always assumed her mother rented. She had never asked. It had not occurred to her to ask because she had not been paying attention. Clipped to the deed was a handwritten note. "Hold in trust for its use. See Halcourt and Breen." She had never heard of Halcourt and Breen. She set the envelope down. She picked up the white envelope with her name on it and looked at it for a long time before she opened it. The back was blank. The paper inside was folded in thirds, 4 pages, the writing close and careful at the start and looser toward the end, the pen pressing harder as it went. "Dear Ivy, if you're reading this, you came to clean the place out yourself, which means things are exactly as hard for you as I thought they might be by now, and I'm sorry I'm not there to say that to your face. I tried to find a way to say most of this while I was alive, and I was not good at it. Your sister will tell you I was not good at a lot of things, and she's right about some of them. But this one I want to explain properly, so I wrote it down and I put it where only someone willing to do the hard work would find it. You always were the one willing to do the hard work. You just forgot that about yourself for a while. I expect you've had some hard years. I expect you've been too proud to tell me how hard. That's all right. I know that kind of proud. I invented it. Ivy stopped. She read the next paragraph, and her chest did something she hadn't expected. You probably noticed the shop is cleaner than it has any right to be. That's Fletcher Ossie, across the lane. He's kept the lights off and the pipes alive all winter. There's a clock in the front window, the Seth Thomas mantel clock, the one with the cracked bezel I never got around to fixing. I want you to leave it wound. I've kept that clock running for 31 years. I'll tell you why, because I never told anyone. Not your father. Not Shelley. Not you. She turned to the binders then, because she had to. The first binder opened to a page near the middle, her mother's small handwriting in blue pen, dated entries one after another. March 8th. Mrs. Kowalski, widow, lives on Cedar. Brought in a watch that hadn't run since her husband died 6 years ago. Said she kept it in a drawer because she couldn't bear to hear it tick, but also couldn't bear to throw it out. Fixed it for free. Told her the mainspring had just needed cleaning. She cried when she heard it running. Told her it wasn't broken, just tired. Left her with tea in 2 hours. April 23rd. Man came in, wouldn't give a name. Had a pocket watch that turned out to be his father's, handed over at a citizenship ceremony 30 years ago. Crystal cracked, stem missing. I had the part in the drawer, did it while he waited. He offered to pay. I told him there was no charge for a thing that held that much. He stood at the counter for a moment after, like he wasn't sure what to do with kindness. Then he said thank you, and left. Ivy turned forward, then back, then forward. Page after page, entry after entry, 31 years of them. Not watches repaired for pay, watches repaired for nothing, or nearly nothing, for people her mother had decided needed it. Clocks collected from seniors' homes and nursing facilities and returned wound and running. A carriage clock brought in by a woman fleeing a marriage with nothing but the clothes she wore, and a clock she'd grabbed off the mantel on her way out. Vera had fixed it and stored it in the back room for 4 months, until the woman had somewhere to take it. A child's alarm clock, plastic, the kind that cost $12, repaired at no charge, because the child had saved for months to buy it, and couldn't bear that it had broken. Her mother had run a watch repair shop for 31 years, and somewhere inside that, she had also been running something else, a thing with no name and no sign. Ivy went back to the letter. The clock in the window is because of a woman named Dorothy Plevin, though I don't suppose she knew my name. The first winter I had this shop, 1993, a woman knocked on the locked door at 4 in the afternoon, closing time, with a mantel clock wrapped in a bath towel. She'd walked from the other side of town. I could see her shoes were wrong for the weather. I had already turned off my bench lamp and was putting on my coat. I told her through the glass I was closed, come back tomorrow. She nodded and went away. I found out 2 weeks later, from Bev at the pharmacy, that Dorothy Plevin had died. She'd been trying to get her late husband's clock repaired before Christmas, so her grandchildren would have something of his to remember. She had walked across town in November shoes, and I had sent her back into the cold, because I was tired and I wanted to go home. I have kept that Seth Thomas wound and running in the front window every day since. It means I'm here. If you can see the hands moving, someone is at the bench and the door will open. That's all. Just a clock in a window so the next Dorothy Plevin doesn't walk away with her hands empty. Ivy set the pages down on her knees. She was crying. She hadn't cried since the funeral. She had been too busy being numb, which is what she called it when she didn't want to call it what it was. And now it came up without warning, the way things do when you've been keeping them at the bottom of yourself through sheer force of administration. The shop was cold around her. It smelled of her mother, and she sat on the concrete floor of a room where her mother had hidden the truth of her own life, and she read the rest of the letter. And she learned that the woman she had spent the last 7 months not speaking to was someone she had never properly met. Outside, the afternoon was going gray. The salvage company she had planned to call had long since stopped answering for the day. She did not call them. She sat in the building. Craig had called worthless, and read about strangers her mother had spent 30 years refusing to send away empty-handed, and for the first time since the divorce, since before the divorce, since the long low stretch of years, She had been quietly calling her life. She felt something other than the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding it together through grit alone. The third binder was the oldest. Its coil had rusted at 3 of the 12 loops, and the cover had gone the faded burgundy of something that started out a darker color. The first entry was from 31 years ago, 3 months after the shop opened, November 14th. Kept the clock going all night. An old man came by at 7 after dark, saw us moving in the window and knocked. I let him in. He'd been carrying a bag watch for 40 years that hadn't run in 20. His wife had given it to him on their wedding day. She died in the spring. He wanted it running again before winter. I sat with him for 2 hours while I worked on it, and he told me about her, and I listened. His name was Armand. I didn't charge him. He left the clock tin on the counter on his way out. A shortbread tin with $12 and change in it, a note that said, "For the next one." I didn't know what to do with it. I left it on the shelf. Somebody else left another $1 in it the following week. I've decided to let it be what it wants to be. Ivy read every entry in that first binder. She was not tracking time. The window had gone from gray to black before she looked up. She found herself in the third binder, near the back. An entry dated 19 months ago. Ivy called this evening. We talked for 12 minutes. Or I talked and she was quiet in the way she's been quiet since the divorce. Empty quiet, wounded quiet, the kind that fills the room without making any sound. She didn't tell me how bad it is. She never tells me how bad it is, but I can hear it. I've heard that specific silence before. I made it myself for years after her father left when I didn't want anyone to know I was barely keeping the lights on. She's proud, Lord, she's proud. Prouder than is good for her, which she got from me. So can't say much. She'll stop calling for a while, the way she does when she feels like she's failing at something. She'll go quiet and I won't push, and eventually she'll come back. Push, no, she will, she always does. But I'm putting this in the book because I want it said somewhere. She's not failing. She's just at the part of the story that feels like the end and isn't. I know that part. I lived that part for 3 years in this very building when your father went and the girls were small, and I didn't know whether the shop would make it through another January. She's going to be fine. She's going to be more than fine. She just has to find her way back to herself. I hope she finds this book before too much time has passed. I hope she finds it while there's still time to do something with what she finds. I should have said all this to her on the phone. I couldn't find the words that wouldn't sound like pity, and she doesn't want pity. She wants someone to say, "I see you and you're not done. I see you, Ivy. You are not done." Ivy pressed her hands flat on the open binder. She sat with it for a long time. She had not told her mother about the divorce, not really. The facts, yes, eventually, but not the scale of it, not the way it had taken the bottom out of everything, not the rented room above the restaurant, or the envelopes she stopped opening. She had called every few weeks and talked about nothing, because talking about nothing was the only safe thing. And her mother had listened to every nothing, and heard through it to what was underneath. She had stopped calling because she was ashamed. And then she had run out of time to start again. She sat at her mother's workbench, and she let it all come up. The 7 months, the calls she hadn't made, the Christmas she'd skipped because she couldn't face being seen that way, the birthday her mother had called on and she'd kept at 5 minutes because she could hear her own voice fraying at the edges, and she didn't want to explain why. All of it came up and out, and she let it, because there was no one else in the building and the clock in the front window was the only thing moving. If you're still with Ivy in that repair shop, hit subscribe before we go any further. Because what happens when the developer's letter arrives is the part of this story I've been holding back. The letter from the municipality came 3 days later. Not a developer, the municipality itself, acting on behalf of a transit authority that wanted the Elgin Street corridor for a light rail expansion. 11 properties along that stretch were in the proposed acquisition zone. The offer for her mother's building, based on current assessed value of commercial properties, was $214,000. Ivy read it standing at the counter, where her mother had spent 31 years bent over small things with a loop in her eye. Fletcher Ossie, who turned out to be a 60-year-old man who ran a locksmith operation out of a converted garage 2 buildings down the lane, had been the one to slip it under the door. He knocked 30 seconds after, and Ivy let him in, and he read her face before she could arrange it. "So they effed you," he said. He had known her mother for 22 years. He sat down on the stool behind the counter the way a man sits on a stool he's sat on 1,000 times, and he told Ivy things she had not known. How her mother had rebuilt the shop's client base 3 times over the decades, each time after some blow. The downtown exodus, the big box stores. The year everyone decided watches were obsolete right up until they decided they weren't. How Vera had stayed open when every other independent repair business on Elgin Street had closed. Not out of stubbornness, but out of a specific conviction about what it meant to be somewhere reliably. How she had kept the clock wound in the window every single day because she believed, in a way she never put into religious terms. But that functioned like faith, that showing up every day in the same place created something in a community that you could not replace once it was gone. She told me once, Fletcher said, that the hardest part of this work wasn't the repairs, it was the calls. The ones you get a week later, sometimes a month, asking if a piece is ready, and you have to say it's not yet. It's taking longer than expected. And you know what they're not saying is that the clock belonged to someone, and the clock matters, and waiting for it to come back is a small grief they're carrying alongside the large one. He looked at the workbench. She never once made someone feel foolish for caring about a clock. 31 years, and I don't think she lost a piece. Every single one came back running. Ivy's phone rang. It was Shelley. I got a notice from the municipality, Shelley said, about Mom's property on Elgin. Craig looked into it. $214,000. That's what they're offering for the assessed value. But he thinks if we push back we could get closer to 260, maybe 270. The thing is, there's a trust listed in the deed records. Which, can you explain that? Because Craig says if there's a trust we don't know about, that changes the estate. Mom owned the building outright, Ivy said. It's in trust. You can call the lawyers, Halcourt and Breen. Silence on the line. Then Shelley, in her careful voice, there's a trust for a watch repair shop. There's a trust for what the shop is for. It's a closed business. Mom is gone. The practical thing, Craig cleared the savings account before the flowers were off the table, Ivy said. He kept the house proceeds. He sold Mom's car to his nephew for $800. He handed me 4 boxes and a set of keys and told me there was nothing worth keeping. She kept her voice the way she'd learned to keep it when she wanted it to hold. Tell me what the practical thing is. A pause. Then Craig's voice, nearby, not quite on the call, and Shelley's, we're not done with this. No, Ivy said. We're not. She hung up. Fletcher was watching her from his stool with the expression of a man watching something go the way he had hoped it would go. She chose right, he said quietly. Your mother, she chose right. Ivy did not drive back to Ottawa that night. She slept in the storage room at the back of the shop, on a folding cot she found behind the curtain beside a spare work lamp, and a box of back issues of a schmatzing journal her mother had subscribed to since 1988. The cot had sheets on it. The lamp was plugged in. Someone had made it ready. She lay awake and listened to the sounds of Elgin Street and watched the reflection of the clock in the front window on the low ceiling, the sweep of the second hand visible even from the back, if she propped herself up on her elbow, and she thought about Dorothy Plevin and her bath towel-wrapped clock and November shoes in the closed door. In the morning, Fletcher brought coffee and a woman Ivy had not met. Harriet Naomi Voss was 74 years old. She had worked for Vera Calloway for 19 years before her hip had made standing at a bench impossible. She was small and upright, with the particular precision of movement of someone who had spent decades handling tiny things, and when she walked through the front door and looked around at the swept benches and the tins and the labels on the bins and the clock in the window, with its hands still moving, she put one hand on the display case and stood there for a moment before she could come in any further. Still running, she said. About the clock. She came and took both of Ivy's hands and looked at her the way older women look at you when they are checking something they already know. You have your mother's hands, she said. I'd know them anywhere. Same fingers, same way of keeping them still when you're paying attention. Harriet had known everything. The clock, the binders, the tin, the arrangement with Fletcher, all of it. She had worked alongside Vera for nearly 2 decades, and she had spent countless evenings after closing helping to repair pieces that came in from the shelter downtown, watches and clocks brought to Vera by social workers and nurses who knew that Vera could be called on and would not make anyone feel the size of what they'd needed. She hated the word charity, Harriet said. They were sitting in the 2 chairs Vera had kept behind the counter for slow afternoons, which turned out to be few. She said charity put someone above and someone below, and she had no interest in being above anyone. She said all she was doing was her job, just not always charging for it. She'd say, the work is the same. A movement is a movement. Why would I do less of my best work because someone has less money than someone else? She got up and went to the wall beside the register, where a corkboard hung, layered with papers and cards and photographs Ivy had looked at without fully seeing. Harriet pointed to a photograph near the top right. A younger Vera at one of the benches, loop in her eye, bent over something small, not looking at the camera. There she is, Harriet said. Every picture in this place. I don't think she's looking at the camera in a single one, always working. She moved her hand to another. A Christmas party of some kind. The display case pushed aside, people standing with cups. Vera in the back, passing a plate of something to a woman Ivy didn't recognize. She let 3 different women use the back room as a mailing address, Harriet said. Over the years. Women who couldn't use their own addresses. She never spoke about it. I only found out because I came in early one morning and saw her writing out an envelope with someone else's name on the return. She tapped another photograph. Vera in a parking lot, loading something into someone else's car. She was smiling, but not at the camera. At whoever was driving. Some women put their names on buildings, Harriet said. Your mother put her name on a set of habits she never told anyone about. That's harder to do. And it's the only kind that lasts after you're gone. While they talked, people came. A woman in her 40s arrived first, with a teenage boy slouching behind her who turned out, when he stopped slouching, to be watching everything with the attention of someone who doesn't want anyone to know he's paying attention. The woman had heard, somehow. Merritt Falls is a town of 22,000, and word moves through it the way it always has, through the pharmacy and the arena, and whoever runs into whoever at the Foodland. That Vera Calloway's daughter was at the shop asking questions, and she had to come. Her mother, she said, had come through this shop in 2011 after leaving her husband with 2 children, and the clothes they were wearing. She'd had a watch, her own mother's watch, that had stopped working on the night she left, which she'd taken as a sign of something she didn't want to think about. Vera had fixed it in 45 minutes, without asking a single question about why the woman looked the way she looked. She'd handed it back, running, and said, it just needed to know you still wanted it. Then she'd taken the woman's phone number and called her own contact at a rental housing service in town. And 2 weeks later, the woman and her children had an apartment. I didn't know the connection until years later, the woman said. I thought it was luck. Then I found out your mother had been calling that housing service on behalf of women for 12 years. The boy had stopped pretending not to listen. An older man came in the afternoon. He said he had sat in this shop every Thursday for 3 years after his wife died. Nominally to bring in clocks from his house that needed servicing. But really, he said, to be somewhere that felt like someone gave a damn whether he showed up. Vera had given him tea and the Thursday afternoon crossword, and they had done it together at the counter while she worked, and she had charged him exactly what the repairs actually cost, and not a cent of sentiment. She was not a sentimental woman, he said without any criticism in it. She was a precise woman, which is its own kind of love, if you think about it. A man Ivy's age arrived near closing, thin and careful with his words. He said he had come through Merritt Falls 11 years ago, in the kind of state that doesn't have a polite name. He had seen the clock moving in the shop window at 9 o'clock in the evening, and he had knocked because the moving hands meant someone was there. And he hadn't wanted to be the only one awake in the world that night. Vera had let him in. She had given him tea. She had shown him a movement she was working on, a French anniversary clock, the kind with the rotating pendulum, and explained to him, in detail, in the ordinary voice of someone explaining a thing they find genuinely interesting, how it worked. She had talked to him for 2 hours about clockwork, and he had never once had to explain himself. He had a daughter now. He had a job he cared about. He had sent Vera a card every year since, never signed, just a line or 2. He had not known, to know she read them, that they were in the binders. He had not won the binders. He had not wanted to tea, and then she had made him curious about pendulums, and he had kept going to find out what else worked that way. Ivy thought of the unsigned cards in the binder and said nothing. She reached over and put her hand on his for a moment and let it rest there. A retired librarian came at 4 o'clock. She did not have a dramatic story, she said, a little apologetically. She had simply been a woman with a modest pension and an inherited clock collection she couldn't afford to maintain. And Vera had quietly discounted every invoice for 15 years, and then one day stopped invoicing at all. And when she asked about it, Vera had said she had decided the collection was a community resource, and should be serviced accordingly. She let me keep my pride, the woman said, while she quietly did what she was going to do anyway. That's a rare kind of person. She put 2 folded bills in the shortbread tin on her way out, the way she said she'd been doing for years. If you've stayed with Ivy this far, please subscribe before the next part. Because Shelley and Craig are about to walk through that door, and what Craig has in his pocket is the thing this whole story has been building toward. Shelley called on a Thursday to say they had retained a lawyer to review the trust on the grounds that their mother had not been of sound mind when she executed it, that the secrecy, the hidden savings, the concealed property, pointed to someone not thinking clearly. Ivy read the lawyer's letter at the counter, with Fletcher standing beside her because she had called him when she'd seen the return address. "She wants to call Mom crazy?" Ivy said. "To break the trust and sell to the transit authority." Fletcher went to the lane and came back with a box. In the box, 19 years of receipts from his own work on the building. Boiler calls, plumbing, a new electrical panel in 2018. Each receipt with a note from Vera in the corner. What else needed doing, what she wanted done next, who to call if something went wrong. Clear handwriting, he said. Right to the end. You show those to whoever needs to see them. Harriet produced the client ledgers from her own home. Vera had given her copies when her hip had forced her to stop coming in, so that Harriet could consult on unusual pieces without having to make the trip. 19 years of records in Vera's hand. Date, piece, work performed, cost charged. And there are 100 clients in this town, Harriet said. Who shook hands with that woman last year and watched her remember the exact condition of every clock they'd ever brought in. They want to call her incompetent. They're going to have to do it to a room full of people. The hearing was held on a Wednesday in the county courthouse, a room with acoustic tile ceiling and institutional chairs. Ivy sat with the lawyers from Halcourt and Breen, who turned out to be a woman named Okafor Bright, who had driven from Toronto and charged by the hour, but had clearly also read the file and arrived with some feeling about what it contained. The back rows were full. The woman whose mother had been helped in 2011, the man who'd had 3 years of Thursday crosswords, the man who now had a daughter and a job, and a reason, the librarian, Fletcher in a jacket Ivy had not seen him wear before, Harriet upright with her hands folded, and a dozen other people Ivy had met in the 4 days since she'd opened the shop door, and a dozen more she had not, who had come because Merritt Falls is a town of 22,000 and they knew what was being decided. Craig's lawyer made his argument. Hidden assets, concealed property, secret accounts. Conduct, he said, inconsistent with transparency and rational estate management. Okafor answered with the medical files, then the receipts, then the client ledgers. Then she did something the law did not require. She let the room speak. The woman from 2011 stood first. She said, "This woman fixed my mother's watch and then found my mother housing. And I didn't know for years that those two things were connected. And I'm standing here to tell you that a woman who operates that quietly for that long is not operating out of confusion. She is operating out of purpose." The man with the crossword stood and said, "For 3 years she made me feel like a person in a world that had gone sideways. And there was nothing wrong with her mind. There was tremendous generosity in it." The man with the daughter stood and his voice only broke once. He said, "She made me curious about how things work, and that was enough. And a woman who knows enough about people to do exactly that is not a woman who doesn't know what she's doing." One after another, they stood. Shelley sat through it. She sat through all of it. And partway through she stopped looking at Craig and started looking at the people speaking, and her expression went through something. Ivy could not quite read from across the room. A slow recalibration, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The judge reviewed the evidence and dismissed the challenge in less than an hour. Craig gathered his papers. Shelley didn't move right away. She sat in her chair after Craig was already up, and she watched the room empty around her, and when she finally stood, she walked toward the back, and she had to pass Ivy's row. She stopped. Craig was already at the door. Shelley looked at Ivy, and her jaw was set, but underneath the set jaw was something Ivy had not seen on her sister's face since they were children. A species of uncertainty. The first crack in a certainty Shelley had carried her whole life. She went through the door without speaking. Spring came to Elgin Street. Ivy had moved into the apartment above the shop, which turned out to exist, a one-bedroom space reached by a staircase behind the curtain that she had walked past a dozen times as a child without ever being told what was up there. The floor creaked at the second step and the kitchen window looked directly into the brick wall of the travel agency next door. But the rent was nothing. and in the morning she could hear the clock in the shop window below if she lay still. She had called Okafor Bright and learned exactly what the trust permitted. The building and the funds were designated for the continuation of the shop's work, a watch and clock repair service operating with the additional mandate of providing those services at reduced or no cost to anyone who needed it. Her mother had written the mandate herself, Okafor said, in the kind of language that meant she'd thought about it for years before she committed it to paper. Irrevocable, Okafor said, the word her mother had chosen and underlined in the margin of the draft. Ivy had not repaired a watch in 12 years. Her mother had started her on movements when she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool at the second bench. She had been good at it, her mother had told her, in the way her mother told her things, matter of fact, without decoration, which was how Vera said everything she meant most. She sat down at the bench and picked up a movement, and found that her hands knew more than she'd thought they still knew. Fletcher came in the first week, and helped her source parts she was missing. Harriet came 2 afternoons a week and sat with her, not at a bench anymore but in the chair, consulting on movements she recognized from the records, reminding Ivy of techniques her mother had perfected over the years, passing down a chain of small knowledge from hand to hand. The clock in the window stayed wound. Ivy wound it herself every morning, before she opened the bench lamp. She stripped the workbenches down and cleaned them the way her mother had cleaned them, properly, not quickly, and set up the bins in the same order, because the order was right, and she knew it was right because she had looked at it 10,000 times as a child, and never once thought to ask why. She scraped the price list off the glass case and wrote a new one in her mother's style, clear and plain and without flourish. She put the binders on the shelf beside the register where anyone who came in could see them, and she framed the letter on the wall beside the corkboard, and she made a new sign for the door in the same hand as the old one, Calloway & Co., Watch and Clock Repair. Below it, smaller, Est, 1971. Open. The morning the shop officially reopened, it was warm enough to leave the front door propped. Fletcher came before she'd turned on the bench lamp, then Harriet with a tin of actual shortbread. The man from Thursday afternoons came and sat in the chair, and said he'd brought a carriage clock that he'd been putting off, because he hadn't known who to bring it to, and now he did. The woman from 2011 came with her son, who was not slouching, and who stood in front of the corkboard for 10 minutes reading the photographs and the names underneath them. Shelley came in the afternoon, alone, no Craig. She stood in the doorway, the way someone stands in a place they are not sure they're allowed. Then she came in fully, and looked at the benches and the bins, and the clock in the window and the binders on the shelf. Ivy came out from the back. Shelley said, without preamble, "Can we talk?" They went outside where the afternoon was warm on the brick and the old sign was back on its bracket and the hands on the clock in the window were moving. "I didn't know her," Shelley said. "She was looking at the sign, not at Ivy. I thought I did. I thought I knew what I was dealing with. A small business, a closed shop, a mother who had been difficult in specific ways for my entire life. I sat in that room and listened to those people, and I understood somewhere in the middle of it that I'd been measuring her in the wrong units for 30 years. She reached into her bag. She took out an envelope. The house cleared for $162 after costs and Craig's fees. My share was $81,000. Half of that, less what I needed to cover the winter, is here. It's $38,000. It's made out to the trust." Ivy took the envelope. "It's not enough," Shelley said. "I know that, but it's what I have right now, and I wanted it to go to the right place." She looked at her sister. There was a long pause that held years in it. "I'm sorry," Shelley said. "About the 7 months." "I didn't help." Ivy looked at the check in the envelope, then at her sister. Shelley had not stopped looking at the sign. "Okay," Ivy said. "Okay," Shelley said quietly. She did not try to hug her and Ivy did not reach for her. And that was right for now, because some distances close slowly and at their own pace. But she was here, on Elgin Street, in the afternoon light, and Ivy did not wonder whether she was coming back. Inside, the shop had settled into what it was. Harriet telling the man with the carriage clock something involved about escapements. The son of the woman from 2011, asking Fletcher a question about the corkboard, the shortbread tin on the shelf by the register, its lid off, and 2 people, Ivy did not know yet, leaving coins in it as they came in. The bell above the door gave its single note, and Ivy turned and a woman came in. She was in her 60s, Ivy thought, in a good coat, gone thin at one elbow, holding a cloth bag carefully, the way you hold something fragile. Her eyes found the clock in the window first, and then the binders on the shelf, and then Ivy. "Someone at the seniors center told me," the woman said, "that you don't turn people away. She said the clock in the window means the door's open." "That's right," Ivy said. "Come in. What have you got?" The woman reached into the cloth bag and brought out a mantel clock. Not a valuable one, ceramic case, the kind sold in sets at department stores in the 80s. But it was wrapped in a dish towel and set in nice at the bag with the care of something irreplaceable. "It was my mother's," the woman said. "It stopped the day she died, and I put it away for a year, and now I'd like it running again, if that's possible. I'm not sure I can pay right away, but leave it with me," Ivy said. "There's no charge for something that matters this much." The woman's hands were not steady when she set it on the counter. Ivy took it carefully, the way her mother had always taken things. Both hands, full attention, like the object understood whether you were serious. "How long will it take?" "A week," Ivy said. "Maybe less. I'll call you when it's ready. And when you come to get it, I'll show you how to wind it yourself so you don't have to bring it back for that." The woman stood at the counter for a moment with her empty hands, the way people stand when they have handed over something they are trusting you with. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." "You're in the right place," Ivy said. "Come back Thursday if you want company while you wait. We do crosswords." Late that afternoon, after the last person had gone, and Harriet had gone home and Fletcher had gone back across the lane, and the shortbread tin was 2/3 full, and the light on Elgin Street had gone from gold to the particular blue that comes before dark, Ivy stood alone at her mother's bench. She looked at the movement in front of her. It was the Seth Thomas, the one from the window, the one with the cracked bezel, the one her mother had never gotten around to fixing. Ivy had finally taken it off the sill to look at it properly, and now it lay open on the cloth in front of her, its parts in the order her mother had always laid things out, left to right, in sequence of removal, so you always knew how to put it back. It was fixable. It had always been fixable. Her mother had kept it in the window unrepaired, because a clock that was running but imperfect was more honest than one that pretended everything was fine. Ivy looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it back in the window, bezel and all, and switched on the lamp beside it. Through the glass she could see Elgin Street settling into evening, the lights coming on in the buildings across the road, a car slowing at the corner, a woman walking quickly with her collar up, and here from the street what they would see, a narrow storefront with a hand-lettered sign, and in the window, lit from inside, a clock with its hands moving. Vera Calloway had spent 31 years keeping that clock running and that light on, so that no one who could see the window would ever have to walk away, the way Dorothy Plevin had walked away, cold, with her hands empty, into a November that had no intention of being kind. And when she could no longer keep it going herself, she had hidden the whole truth of it under the floor of her own back room, and trusted that her daughter, the proud one, the quiet one, the one who needed to lose enough before she could come home and see what had been waiting for her here, would find it. Ivy stood at the window with the lamp burning beside the clock, and she looked out at the street and she thought, I have been wrong about what I lost, and I have been wrong about what was left. She went back to the bench. There was work to do tonight and tomorrow, and the day after, for as long as she had hands for it and a lamp to work by, the clock kept running. She wound it in the morning, same as always.